The vision did not arrive as a whisper. It hit like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and forcing him to his knees in the dry, cracked earth. Nahum gripped the dirt, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. He was not a king, nor a soldier, yet he felt the entire weight of a city collapsing within the marrow of his own bones. The sky above him remained clear, but in his mind, he saw the horizon turn to smoke. He tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, trembling under the sheer magnitude of what he had seen. He wiped grit from his forehead, his hands shaking. The silence of the desert was absolute, yet it roared in his ears with the sound of falling stone. He looked up, squinting against the harsh light, his eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering outline of Nineveh. He was an ordinary man, a man of dust and bone, now tethered to a truth that would shatter the world he knew. He forced himself upright, one agonizing inch at a time, until he stood steady. The burden was no longer a weight he carried. It was the path he had to walk. He took the first step forward, leaving the safety of the wilderness behind, moving toward the gates of the empire. Nineveh rose from the plains like a mountain forged by human hands. Its walls were not merely stone, they were a statement of defiance against the natural order. From the distance, the city caught the morning light, reflecting a blinding gold that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of an empire that believed it had conquered time itself. Thousands of soldiers patrolled the ramparts, their movements precise, synchronized, and relentless. They moved with the confidence of men who had never known a true defeat. The city gates were massive, reinforced with iron and bronze, designed to dwarf anyone who approached. Inside, the architecture defied gravity, with soaring towers and vast courtyards that echoed with the constant, rhythmic thrum of industry and military preparation. Every street was a testament to order, every monument a celebration of dominion. The people walked with their heads high, convinced that their prosperity was a sign of divine favor. They looked at the horizon and saw only more land to claim, more borders to push, and more history to write in their own image. There was no fear here, only the cold, hard certainty of absolute power. The city breathed with the arrogance of a civilization that had mistaken its own reach for the boundaries of the universe. It stood as a monument to its own permanence. Look closer at the base of those towering walls. Beneath the polished stone and the gilded reliefs, the mortar tells a different story. It is dark, stained, and brittle. The city was not built by architects alone. It was raised on the backs of the broken. Thousands of laborers died in the heat, their bodies discarded into the foundations to ensure the structure would hold. The ground here does not smell of incense or wealth. It smells of iron and old dried earth. Every block was set into place with the force of a whip. The cracks in the lower masonry are not from age, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the injustice packed into every layer. If you press your hand against the stone, you can feel the vibration of the city above, but the foundation itself is cold, hollow, and hungry. This was the true architecture of Nineveh. They traded lives for height and blood for stability. The walls were not just stone, they were a ledger of every life stolen to build them. A man stepped out of the dust of the road and onto the paved approach of the main gate. He did not carry a banner, nor did he offer the customary salute to the guards standing watch. Nahum simply walked until he reached the center of the threshold, then stopped. He stood there, a solitary figure against the backdrop of bronze and iron, his presence a jarring silence in the middle of the city's roar. Merchants with heavy carts pulled their beasts to a halt, shouting for him to move. He did not blink. He did not step aside. He stood like a stone in a rushing stream, forcing the tide of the city to break and flow around him. People slowed, their eyes catching his, and for a fleeting second, the rhythm of their day faltered. He was a mirror, and in his stillness, the city began to see the cracks in its own reflection. The pause lasted only a heartbeat. Then, the city surged forward, eager to bury the moment under the weight of its own noise. From the inner plazas, a low, rhythmic chanting began to swell, rising like a tide against the gates. It was a song of eternal glory, a practiced, melodic affirmation that Nineveh was the beginning and the end of history. Thousands of voices joined in, a wall of sound designed to drown out any doubt, any silence, any prophet. Merchants resumed their shouting, Soldiers slammed their spears against the stone in time with the chorus, and the streets vibrated with the collective force of their arrogance. They looked through Nahum as if he were a ghost, their eyes fixed on the horizon of their own making. They were so busy constructing their own myth of immortality that they did not notice the air growing thin or the way the shadows in the alleys refused to dance to their rhythm. They were singing their victory songs while the ground beneath them began to hold its breath. Nahum opened his mouth. He did not shout, yet his voice cut through the crescendo of the city like a blade through silk. The first word was a single sharp syllable that hit the stone plaza and echoed back, stripping the melody from the air. The chanting faltered. It did not stop all at once. It withered, dying in the throats of the singers as they stumbled over the sudden, hollow silence. Nahum stepped forward, his boots scraping against the grit of the road. He spoke of a reality that existed outside their monuments and beyond their borders. He spoke of a moral law that did not care for the reach of their empire or the height of their walls. The illusion of eternity shattered. It fell away like dust from a crumbling statue. He told them that history was not a loop of their own making, but a story written by a hand they had long ignored. The soldiers lowered their spears, the merchants froze, and the weight of his words pressed down on the square, heavier than the stone of the palace. The city was no longer the center of the world. It was merely a house of cards, and the wind had finally begun to blow. Inside the command chambers, the generals paced with the confidence of men who believed they had mastered the art of survival. They pointed at maps, tracing lines of conquest that stretched across the known world. One general slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the bronze markers that represented their legions. He spoke of the iron grip they held over the provinces, claiming that as long as the sword remained sharp, the empire would never know a sunset. They laughed at the idea of a threat, their voices booming against the high stone ceilings. They were architects of their own demise, though they did not know it. Every new decree to expand the borders, every order to crush dissent with greater force, was a stone pulled from the foundation of their own city. Suddenly, a low vibration hummed through the floorboards. The wine in their cups rippled, and the heavy table groaned under the unseen pressure. The lead general shook his head, dismissing the tremor as a minor shift of the earth, and immediately ordered a new wave of archers to the front lines. The king sat on his throne, his fingers tracing the cold, polished stone of the armrests. A scout knelt before him, breath ragged, reporting the movement of an unseen force at the northern perimeter. The king did not look up. He watched the torchlight dance on the far wall, his expression fixed in a mask of absolute indifference. When the scout finished, the king stood, walked to the brazier, and snatched the parchment from the man's trembling hands. He held it over the flames until the edges curled and blackened, then let it drop into the ash. He dismissed the scout with a wave of his hand. To the king, the threat was a phantom. He turned his back on the chamber, pacing toward the balcony that overlooked the city. He saw only the order of his streets and the height of his walls, interpreting the distant sounds as the rhythm of a kingdom that would last forever. He retreated into the deepest part of the palace, locking the heavy doors. He sat in the dark, waiting for a dawn that would never break. Far beneath the gilded halls, the air hung thick with pulverized stone and the metallic tang of sweat. Here, the rhythm of the city was not the sound of drums, but the relentless, grinding scrape of chisels against granite. Men moved in a synchronized, hollow cadence, their backs bent under the weight of massive blocks destined for the king's monuments. One worker stumbled, his legs buckling as he dropped his load, the stone shattering against the floor. He did not rise. The overseer did not pause to check for life. He simply stepped over the body and gestured for the others to continue. No one spoke. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that filled the tunnels. Every hammer strike echoed with the weight of 1,000 grievances, vibrating through the floor and up into the very foundations of the city. The city above continued its life of luxury, unaware that the ground beneath it was becoming hollowed out by its own cruelty. The marketplace was the first place where the change became visible. For generations, the air here had been filled with the aggressive shouts of traders and the clatter of coins. Now, the noise thinned. A merchant stood behind his stall, his hand hovering over a display of grain, but he did not call out to the passing crowd. He watched a group of citizens huddled near the fountain, their heads bowed, speaking in tones that never rose above a frantic murmur. A buyer approached, offering a gold coin stamped with the royal seal, but the merchant did not take it. He looked at the coin, then at the buyer, and shook his head. He pulled his goods back from the edge of the table, a small, defensive movement that spoke volumes. The buyer stared, confused, then looked around at the other stalls. Everywhere, the same hesitation took hold. People were no longer looking at the goods. They were looking at each other. A woman dropped a basket of fruit, and the sound of rolling pomegranates on the stone floor seemed to echo for an eternity. No one laughed. No one rushed to help. The confidence that had defined Nineveh for centuries was leaking away, replaced by a cold, sharp realization that the foundation was shifting beneath their feet. The Tigris had always been the pulse of Nineveh, a steady, predictable rhythm that fed the empire. But that morning, the water changed. It began to churn with an unnatural, violent restlessness, despite the lack of wind. Where the surface once flowed with a glassy, calm consistency, it now broke into jagged, dark swells. Fishermen, who had worked these banks for decades, pulled their boats to the shore and refused to cast their nets. They stood on the silt, watching as the current swirled in tight, frantic eddies that seemed to defy the natural flow of the riverbed. The water turned a murky, bruised color, thick with sediment that had been disturbed from the deep. It was as if the river itself were trying to purge something from its depths. A group of water carriers stopped at the edge of the quay, their jars empty, staring at the chaotic movement of the waves. They stood frozen, witnessing the primary source of their life turn against the city's order. The sound of the water was no longer a gentle lap against the masonry, but a low, guttural roar, vibrated through the soles of their feet. The river had become a mirror, reflecting the deep, structural instability that was now consuming the heart of the empire. The change did not come from the horizon, but from directly above. The sky began to darken, yet there were no clouds to herald a storm. It was a slow, deliberate bruising of the light, as if the atmosphere itself were being squeezed by an invisible hand. The vibrant blue of the midday sun drained away, replaced by a dull, metallic gray that cast no shadows. People in the streets stopped their work and looked upward, shielding their eyes, waiting for the familiar relief of a breeze. But the air remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. It became heavy, thick with a pressure that made every breath a conscious effort. Birds that usually circled the high towers vanished, their calls silenced. The arrogance that had defined the city's posture for generations began to buckle under this new, crushing weight. Citizens stood in the plazas, their hands pressed against their chests, feeling the sudden, sharp absence of the warmth they had taken for granted. The city, once so certain of its own permanence, found itself trapped beneath a dome of stagnant, heavy air. Every movement felt sluggish, every sound dampened. The panic moved from the streets into the sanctuaries. Priests scrambled to the inner chambers of the great temples, their hands trembling as they lit thick bundles of cedar incense. They prostrated themselves before the towering stone idols, their foreheads pressed hard against the cold, unyielding floor. They chanted the ancient litanies of protection, their voices rising in a desperate, rhythmic crescendo that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. They waited for the familiar sign, a flicker of light, a tremor in the stone, a whisper of wind, but nothing happened. The incense smoke did not drift upward. It hung in the stagnant air, curling into thick, gray ropes that choked the lungs of those who knelt. The priests increased the volume of their pleas, shouting until their throats were raw, yet the stone faces remained fixed in their vacant stares. Only a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The realization rippled through. The gods were not angry. They were absent. Inside the high vaulted throne room, the king paced the length of the polished floor. His boots clicked against the stone, a sharp, lonely sound that died instantly in the vast space. He stopped before the dais, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat, until his knuckles turned white. He had spent a lifetime demanding the world bend to his will, yet now, the silence was the only thing that answered him. He turned toward the heavy doors and shouted for his guards, but the sound did not carry. It seemed to be swallowed by the very walls he had built to project his power. He walked to the window, peering out at the city that was once his to command, but he saw only the same oppressive, gray stillness that had gripped the streets. He turned back to the center of the room, his breath hitching in his chest, He reached out, fingers brushing the cold surface of a ceremonial statue, expecting the familiar spark of authority, but there was nothing. No warmth, no presence. He was a man standing in a tomb of his own making, watching the final, flickering embers of his perceived divinity vanish. The first tremor was subtle, a vibration that hummed through the soles of the king's boots. He froze, eyes darting to the heavy tapestries hanging against the stone walls. They swayed, not from a draft, but from the ground itself. The hum deepened into a low, guttural grinding sound that seemed to rise from the very bedrock beneath the palace. Dust began to rain down from the vaulted ceiling, coating the polished floor in a fine gray powder. The king took a step toward the exit, but the floor tilted beneath him. A hairline fracture appeared in the center of the dais, snaking outward with the sound of snapping bone. The massive stone pillars supporting the roof groaned, their bases shifting inches to the left. The king stumbled, his hands clawing at the air as the ground pitched violently. Every joint in the palace walls shrieked under the sudden, unnatural strain. It was not an earthquake of nature, but a surrender of the earth itself, as if the ground were finally spitting out the weight of the city's history. He fell to his knees as a second, sharper jolt tore through the room, widening the fissure in the floor. The foundation was failing, and the massive weight of the empire was no longer enough to hold the stone in place. Beyond the crumbling palace walls, the horizon told a story the king refused to believe. He stood on the high rampart, squinting against the harsh glare of the sun. Far to the north, where the imperial banners usually snapped in the wind, there was only empty space. He watched as a column of dust rose, not from an incoming force, but from a retreating one. The allied garrisons were pulling back. He gripped the stone railing, his knuckles white, and searched for the familiar glint of spear tips. Nothing. The watchtowers that once marked the perimeter were unmanned. He raised a hand to signal the northern post, but the guard there did not look up. Instead, the man turned his back, gathered his gear, and vanished into the scrubland. One by one, the camps along the border went dark. The fires that had burned for decades were extinguished in a single, coordinated motion. The king watched the last of the cavalry disappear into the haze, leaving the gates of Nineveh wide open to the encroaching silence. The scent of defeat hung heavy in the air, thick and metallic, as the realization solidified. Nineveh was no longer a fortress, but an island, waiting for the tide. The news did not arrive by messenger. It arrived in the sudden, frantic silence of the marketplace. A merchant dropped a crate of grain, the wood splintering against the cobbles, and did not stop to retrieve his goods. He ran. That single act of flight broke the city's collective composure. Within minutes, the bustling thoroughfares emptied. People stopped haggling and started moving with their heads down, eyes scanning the rooftops. Confidence, once the city's primary export, evaporated. In the residential districts, the sound of hammers against timber replaced the usual hum of trade. Families dragged heavy planks across their doorways and nailed them shut while the sun was still high. They did not wait for the cover of night. They worked with trembling hands, sealing themselves into dark rooms as if wood and iron could hold back the encroaching reality. A woman pulled her children inside, bolting the heavy latch with a metallic click that echoed down the alley. Outside, the streets became canyons of shuttered windows and barred gates. Nahum walked the center of the main road, his pace slow and deliberate. He did not shout, yet his presence cut through the frantic noise of the barricading city. Tears tracked through the dust on his face, falling onto the dry earth as he moved past the boarded-up stalls. He stopped at the base of the palace steps, where the guards stood with spears leveled. They moved to strike, but hesitated, their hands faltering as they looked into his eyes. He raised a hand, pointing not at the soldiers, but at the massive stone monuments that lined the plaza. "You built these walls with the blood of the broken," he said, his voice steady despite the weeping. "You mistook your cruelty for strength and your pride for a divine mandate." He walked forward, forcing the guards to step back, his path clearing as if by an invisible weight. He stood in the shadow of the great gates and spoke to the empty air, his words echoing against the cold stone. "The collapse you fear is not coming from outside. It is the harvest of what you have sown. Every stone laid in injustice is a stone that will fall. He turned to the crowd, peering through cracks in their shutters, his gaze lingering on each house. The city held its breath, the silence of the streets now punctuated by the raw, unfiltered truth. Inside the palace, the king of Nineveh swept a goblet of wine from the table, the liquid staining the floor like a spreading bruise. He refused the prophet's words, calling them the whispers of a madman. To silence the rising panic, the council issued a decree, a festival of light and music to span the entire city. They demanded the streets be cleared of debris and the torches lit, regardless of the cost. Musicians were dragged from their homes and ordered to play at the gates, their melodies forced and frantic. The council members walked the plazas, smiling with rigid, unblinking faces, insisting that the empire remained untouchable. They poured wine for the citizens, forcing cups into trembling hands, demanding laughter where there was only hollow fear. The music swelled, a chaotic wall of drums and flutes designed to drown out the silence. It was a performance of normalcy, a desperate mask. Yet, the harder they played, the more the cracks in the pavement seemed to widen. The city was already shivering in the grip of its own denial. The music did not stop because the musicians tired. It stopped because the air itself changed. A sudden, sharp gust tore through the plaza, snapping the strings of the lutes and extinguishing the torches in a single, synchronized breath. Dust, thick and abrasive, began to swirl in the narrow streets, scouring the stone walls until they groaned. The wind did not just blow, it hunted. It found the loose mortar between the bricks and pried, whistling through the gaps like a dying animal. Banners hung for the festival were ripped from their poles, fluttering like tattered wings before being crushed into the mud. Citizens dropped their wine, shielding their eyes as the sky turned a bruised, sickly gray. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and ancient, stagnant river silt. High above, the gargoyles on the palace eaves seemed to vibrate, their stone faces chipped away by the relentless grit. Every street became a tunnel of howling, swirling debris that choked the lungs and blinded the desperate. The city's pride, its carefully curated order, was being dismantled by the very elements it claimed to have conquered. There was no shelter from this pressure. The wind pushed against the heavy gates, testing the hinges, demanding entry. The wind vanished as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving the city in a vacuum of sound. The air grew dense, heavy with the metallic tang of cooling stone. Across the western horizon, the sun began its final descent, sinking behind a thick, stagnant haze. The light did not fade into a gentle dusk. It bled. It spilled across the plazas in a deep, arterial red, staining the white limestone of the palace walls. As the sun dropped lower, the shadows stretched, elongating across the uneven pavement like dark, grasping fingers reaching for the city gates. Every pillar, every statue, and every archway cast a distorted silhouette that seemed to claw at the ground. The people stood motionless in the streets, their own shadows merging with the darkness of the buildings. The red glare caught the dust still suspended in the air, turning the atmosphere into a suffocating crimson shroud. There was no movement from the palace guards. They stood frozen, their forms silhouetted against the burning light. The day did not end with a transition, but with a sudden, absolute severance. The sun touched the horizon line, and for one final moment, the entire city glowed with the color of a fresh wound. Then, the light slipped away entirely, leaving the empire to face the encroaching dark. The silence that followed the sunset was not the quiet of sleep. It was the silence of a held breath. The usual evening roar of Nineveh, the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on stone, the bickering of merchants, the rhythmic chant of temple priests had evaporated. Not a single bird called from the eaves of the high towers. The air hung stagnant, thick enough to feel against the skin, refusing to circulate. In the main marketplace, a merchant stood beside his cart, his hand frozen mid-gesture, staring at the empty street. He opened his mouth to call out, but the sound died in his throat, swallowed by the heavy, pressurized atmosphere. Even the palace guards, usually a constant presence of rhythmic footfalls, stood as if carved from the very stone they protected. Their eyes tracked the darkness, yet they did not shift their weight. The city had become a tomb of its own making. Nineveh was waiting. It was a city suspended in the center of a closing trap, waiting for the first crack in the silence that would signal the end. The silence shattered. It began as a low, guttural vibration beneath the cobblestones, a sound like grinding teeth. Then came the water. The river, once a controlled artery of the empire, surged over its stone embankments with a violent foaming roar. It did not trickle. It hammered against the lower city walls, seeking every crack and fissure in the masonry. Within minutes, the water surged into the subterranean cellars, swirling around grain stores and archives. The sound of liquid rushing into confined spaces echoed through the lower districts, a hollow, churning thud that vibrated through the foundations. In the dark, the water rose, turning the packed earth floors into sludge. It crept up the walls, leaving dark, glistening lines of moisture. People in the lower quarters scrambled to higher ground, their boots splashing through the rapidly deepening pools. The city was no longer just waiting. It was being dismantled from the base up. The river had claimed the streets, and the foundation began to soften. The vibration climbed from the foundations into the iron-bound timber of the city gates. These were the massive bronze barriers that had stood for centuries, yet now they shuddered in their frames. A rhythmic, metallic clanging echoed through the gatehouse as the heavy doors pulsed against their hinges. The force was not human. It was a deep, tectonic tremor that made the very air hum. Rivets began to pop, pinging off the stone like bullets, leaving jagged holes in the bronze plating. The gates groaned, a long, high-pitched scream of stressed metal that rose above the roar of the water. Guards pressed their palms against the surface, only to be thrown back by the violent, erratic jolts. The ground beneath the threshold shifted, causing the stone lintel to crack and shower dust onto the floor. Every bolt, every hinge, every latch was pushed to its breaking point. The massive bronze sheets warped, bowing outward as if something immense were pressing from the other side. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of grinding metal and splintering wood that signaled the end of the city's invulnerability. The metal continued to twist, the frames buckled, and the once impenetrable entrance began to yield. Nahum stood at the center of the plaza, his feet planted firmly on the cracked paving stones. The roar of the water and the grinding of the gate seemed to recede into a dull background hum as he stepped forward. He did not look at the guards or the fleeing crowds. His gaze remained fixed on the towering, ornate pillars of the palace. He raised his right hand, palm open toward the sky, and the movement carried a sudden, heavy stillness. The air grew dense, pressing down with the weight of centuries of accumulated violence. He spoke, his voice cutting through the cacophony. He pointed to the fissures snaking up the walls, the gaps where mortar had turned to dust, and the buckling foundations. He declared that the city had built its height upon the backs of the broken. The stone beneath his feet shifted, a deep crack splitting the plaza. The weight of the coming collapse was not just in the water or the failing metal. It was in the very architecture of their injustice. The palace courtyard filled with the frantic movement of citizens, their faces turned toward the high balcony where the king stood. They shouted, pointing toward the buckling gates and the rising water, desperate for a command or a strategy to stem the tide. The king did not look down. He stood motionless, his back to the window, his attention locked on the row of basalt statues lining the inner sanctum. These idols, carved with rigid, unblinking eyes, offered no response to the tremors shaking the floorboards. A minister grabbed the king's arm, gesturing toward the smoke rising from the outer districts, but the king pulled away, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the central pedestal, placed his hand on the cold stone of the primary deity, and waited. The shouting from the courtyard grew into a roar, yet he did not turn. He stared into the hollow eyes of the statue, his face devoid of recognition. As the ceiling plaster began to flake and drift down like snow, the king remained fixed in his posture of defiance. The darkness did not fall from the sky. It rose from the ground in the outer districts. It moved with a deliberate, steady pace, swallowing the low-lying houses and the narrow alleyways that housed the city's laborers. Where the shadow touched, the light of oil lamps died instantly, not flickering out, but simply ceasing to exist. The street-side torches, fueled by resin and pitch, hissed once and then turned to cold, black charcoal. Families in the outer rings stood on their thresholds, watching as the familiar geometry of their streets vanished into a featureless void. There was no sound of wind or movement within the encroaching blackness, only the absolute erasure of space. A merchant tried to hold a lantern high, but the light hit the edge of the shadow and bent, as if the darkness possessed a physical density that repelled illumination. One by one, the districts went dark, the transition moving inward toward the heart of the city. The watchtowers on the perimeter were the first to disappear, their silhouettes dissolving into the ink-like expanse. The shadow crossed the bridge, and the water beneath it turned from a reflecting surface into a bottomless pit. The city was being unmade. The panic in the streets shifted into a cold, heavy clarity. Soldiers who had spent their lives guarding the perimeter dropped their spears, the metal clattering against the stone with a finality that echoed through the plaza. They looked at the walls they had built, walls constructed from the spoils of broken nations, and saw them not as defenses, but as tombstones. The realization moved through the crowd like a physical wave. This was not a siege by a foreign army. There were no catapults, no invading banners, no enemy soldiers at the gates. The city was unraveling from within, a direct harvest of the violence it had sown for generations. A stone mason stood by a crumbling monument, watching the mortar turn to dust under his hands. He did not run. He understood that the foundation had rotted long before the shadow arrived. The people stopped shouting. They stood in the fading light, watching the cracks widen in the very structures they had once called eternal. The arrogance that had defined their empire for centuries dissolved, replaced by the stark recognition that their own history had finally caught up to them. Every act of cruelty, every conquered village, and every broken promise had been a brick in this collapsing house. The air grew still, heavy with the weight of a debt finally come due. The silence was severed by a sound that started deep in the earth. It was a grinding, tectonic groan, the noise of stone shearing against stone. Far upstream, the massive barriers that had diverted the river for centuries reached their breaking point. A hairline fracture appeared in the center of the masonry, and within seconds, the pressure of the pent-up current tore the structure wide open. The river did not just rise, it surged. A wall of churning brown water and debris accelerating toward the city. The sound escalated from a low rumble to a deafening, sustained roar that vibrated through the very foundations of the palace. Birds took flight in a frantic, dark cloud, sensing the shift in the air pressure before the water arrived. The riverbed, previously a predictable channel, transformed into a violent, churning throat of mud and uprooted trees. At the city gates, the guards felt the ground tremble under their feet. The water hit the first bend with such force that it crested over the banks, spilling into the low-lying fields. The air grew thick with the spray of the river, and the roar became absolute, drowning out every other sound in the city as the wall of water closed the final distance to the iron-bound timber. The roar reached the gates, and then, inexplicably, the city went silent. It was not a lack of noise, but a total collapse of human response. Thousands of people stood in the plazas, their mouths open, their lungs refusing to draw the next breath. The sound of the approaching deluge was so immense that it bypassed the ears and settled directly into the marrow of their bones. A merchant dropped a ceramic jar. It shattered on the stone, but the sound was swallowed by the void. No one looked down. No one turned to run. The instinct for self-preservation had been short-circuited by the sheer scale of the incoming wall of water. Eyes remained fixed on the horizon, wide and unblinking, tracking the brown, churning mass as it crested the final rise. A child reached for a mother's hand, but the mother did not move, her fingers locked in a rigid, clawed grip against her own palm. The guards on the ramparts lowered their weapons, their knuckles white against the wood, their bodies stiffened as if turned to salt. Every movement in the city ceased. They were no longer citizens of an empire, but statues in a gallery of impending ruin, waiting for the final, inevitable impact that would erase the world they knew. The impact arrived not as a strike, but as a total erasure. The water slammed into the outer perimeter with the weight of a collapsing mountain, instantly liquefying the sun-baked mud brick foundations. Where the wall met the flood, the solid earth turned to slurry. The base of the ramparts buckled, sending a tremor through the entire structure that cracked the upper battlements like dry bone. Dust and debris erupted into the air as the masonry lost its purchase on the ground. The water did not stop. It churned through the breach, grinding the bricks into fine silt. Sections of the wall, once considered the pride of the empire, tilted forward and vanished into the brown, swirling vortex. The pressure was relentless, pushing through the gaps and widening them until the entire defensive line disintegrated into the surge. Iron-bound gates were torn from their hinges, twisted like wire, and swept away in the initial rush. The city's primary barrier was gone. In its place, a churning, chaotic river poured into the streets, carrying the remnants of the fortifications with it. The ground beneath the outer plaza turned to liquid. The flood did not respect the sanctity of the inner sanctum. It surged through the palace corridors, a churning, debris-filled current that shattered the heavy cedar doors. Inside the throne room, the water rose with terrifying speed, swirling around the base of the dais. The king stood, his hands gripping the stone armrests as the floor beneath him began to fracture. The water hit the dais, cold and thick with silt, and the heavy stone platform groaned under the sudden, uneven pressure. He tried to step back, but the floor tilted, sending him stumbling into the rising pool. The current caught him immediately. It was not a gentle tide, but a violent, swirling force that stripped him of his footing. He reached out, his fingers clawing at the slick, polished stone of the floor, but the water pulled him away with relentless strength. Tapestries were ripped from the walls. Trailing in the water like drowning limbs, the king was dragged from his seat, his head dipping beneath the surface as the room filled to the ceiling. The throne, once the focal point of the world, stood empty. A jagged bolt of lightning tore through the dark, heavy sky, striking the massive oil reservoirs stored near the palace perimeter. The impact shattered the stone seals, spilling thousands of gallons of thick, black fuel directly into the rising floodwaters. A spark caught the slick surface, and the entire channel erupted in a wall of orange flame. The fire did not just burn, it danced atop the water, feeding on the oil as it surged through the city streets. Where the freezing flood met the intense heat of the inferno, the water began to boil. Massive clouds of scalding steam hissed into the air, creating a blinding, suffocating fog that choked the palace corridors. The firestorm roared, its heat warping the stone pillars and melting the mortar between the bricks. It was a nightmare of opposing forces, the relentless, drowning weight of the water below, and the searing, hungry reach of the fire above. The flames leaped from the surface, licking at the upper balconies. Every splash of the water only served to spread the burning oil further, carrying the destruction into every alley and doorway. The watchtowers, once the pride of the city's skyline, began to fail under the relentless assault of the firestorm. The intense heat caused the limestone blocks to expand and crack, while the mortar turned to dust. A deep, grinding sound echoed through the city, vibrating through the ground like a tectonic shift. The northern tower was the first to yield. It groaned, a long, metallic screech of stone grinding against stone as its base buckled. It tilted slowly, defying gravity for a heartbeat, before the weight of the upper levels forced a catastrophic failure. The entire structure leaned into the void, shedding chunks of masonry. Then, the collapse began in earnest. It was a slow-motion descent, a cascade of falling stone that seemed to swallow the light. The southern tower followed, its foundation liquefying as the heat reached the subterranean support beams. It folded inward, collapsing upon itself. Tons of rock, timber, and iron plummeted into the palace ruins, burying the last remnants of the inner sanctum under a mountain of rubble. The roar of the collapse faded into a hollow, ringing silence. Dust hung in the stagnant air, a thick gray veil that slowly settled over the jagged mounds of stone and splintered timber. The fires, starved of fuel, flickered and died, leaving behind only the acrid scent of charred earth and cooling mortar. Nahum walked through the wreckage, his boots crunching on the pulverized remains of what had once been the seat of an empire. He stopped where the palace gates had stood. There was no grandeur here now, only the indifferent weight of broken rock. The river, having spent its fury, retreated into the shadows, leaving behind a landscape stripped of its arrogance. History had not merely stopped, it had been rewritten in the language of ash. The monuments to human pride lay scattered, indistinguishable from the common rubble of the streets. This was the end of the myth. The walls that were meant to be eternal had proven as fragile as the hands that built them. Nahum stood alone in the quiet, watching the first light of dawn struggle to pierce the haze. The empire was gone, reduced to a memory that would soon be buried by the shifting sands. In the stillness, the truth remained. Power is a fleeting vapor. The wind picked up, stirring the fine gray powder that coated the valley floor. It carried no sound of life, only the dry rattle of debris shifting in the dark. Nahum turned away from the sight, his path leading toward the horizon. Where the sun began to climb, the ruins remained behind, a testament to the vanity of those who mistake their own reach for the reach of the divine. We look at these stones and see a warning. Every civilization, every life is built upon a choice, a foundation. Are we constructing empires of pride that demand their own collapse? Or are we anchoring ourselves in the truth that outlasts the rise and fall of kings? The fall of Nineveh is not just a story of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. It reminds us that security is not found in the height of our walls or the strength of our influence. True stability is found in the humility, to recognize that we are not the masters of our own destiny. When the fires of history burn away the illusions of power, only the foundation of justice remains. The horizon stretched out, vast and indifferent to the wreckage left in the valley. Nahum walked until the city was nothing more than a jagged scar on the landscape. He did not look back. The lesson was not in the stones themselves, but in the realization that human power is always subject to a higher, more enduring justice. We are all builders. We lay bricks of ambition, hope, and pride, often forgetting that the ground beneath us is constantly shifting. The fall of Nineveh serves as a permanent marker, a reminder that the walls we raise to protect our legacy are often the very things that invite our ruin. True security is not found in the strength of our defenses or the reach of our influence. It is found in the quiet humility to recognize that we are not the masters of our own destiny. When the fires of time eventually consume all that we have constructed, the only thing that remains is the truth we chose to stand upon. The dust of the empire has finally settled, leaving behind a clear, open space. It is a space for us to decide what we will build next. The choice is the only thing that is truly ours to keep. As the sun rises, the ruins fade into memory, and the world begins again, defined not by the power of the past, but by the integrity of the foundation we choose for the future. The silence that follows the fire is the most honest sound in history. It does not argue, it does not boast, and it does not plead. It simply exists. Nahum has walked beyond the reach of the city, leaving the debris to the slow reclamation of the earth. What remains is not a monument to greatness, but a blank slate. We stand in the wake of such stories, holding the tools to build our own lives. The temptation to raise walls of pride is constant, yet the outcome is written in the dust. We must choose our foundation with care. If we build upon the shifting sands of our own ambition, we invite the same collapse. If we build upon the bedrock of humility and truth, we anchor our lives against the inevitable erosion of time. The empire of Nineveh is a closed chapter. It asks us to look at our own hands and determine what we are creating. Are we seeking to be masters of a temporary domain, or are we seeking to align ourselves with justice? The sun sets on the valley, and the path forward is clear. We are not the architects of destiny, but we are the stewards of the present. With the memory of the fire fading, we take the next step, building toward a future that does not rely on the strength of walls, but on the integrity of the heart. The wind carries nothing now but the scent of dry earth and cooling stone. The empire that once commanded the world has been reclaimed by the silence of the desert. There is no king left to issue commands, no army to enforce a will, and no wall high enough to defy the passage of time. We are left with the aftermath, a quiet space where the echoes of pride have finally died away. Look at the ground beneath your feet. It is the same earth that held the foundations of Nineveh, and it is the same earth that will hold the structures we build today. We hold the hammer and the stone. We choose the mortar. Every decision we make, every ambition we pursue, and every boundary we set is a brick in our own architecture. The lesson of the fallen is not found in the ruin, but in the opportunity to build differently. We do not need to conquer to be secure. We do not need to dominate to be significant. True strength is found in the ability to stand upright without the need for walls, and true legacy is found in the truth we leave behind. The fire has burned out, the smoke has cleared, and the horizon is wide open. We take the lessons of the past, set them into the foundation of the present, and begin the work. The horizon remains empty, stripped of the towers that once scraped the sky. Where Nineveh stood, only shifting dunes and broken limestone remain. The heat of the day recedes, leaving the air cool and still. We are the final witnesses to this erasure. History does not repeat itself, but it does offer a mirror for those willing to look. We stand at our own threshold, holding the blueprint of our days. The materials we choose determine the lifespan of our work. If we build with the arrogance of the past, we invite the same collapse. If we build with the clarity of the present, we create something that survives the wind. The story of the empire is finished. The story of the individual is ongoing. We walk away from the ruins with the weight of this knowledge in our hands. We do not look back to mourn the stone. We look forward to lay a better foundation. Every action is a choice. Every choice is a testament. We are not the masters of destiny, but we are the architects of our own integrity. The sun dips below the edge of the world, and the path is clear. We begin the work of building something that does not require walls to stand, but truth to endure. The last light fades, leaving the desert in a shroud of gray. The stones that once formed the heart of an empire are now indistinguishable from the sand that surrounds them. There is no sound of industry, no clamor of the marketplace, and no voice of the king. The silence is absolute. It is the final answer to the question of human permanence. We stand in the wake of this history, holding the lessons of the past like a compass in the dark. The choice is no longer about the size of the monuments we raise, but the depth of the truth we hold. We recognize that our strength is not found in the height of our defenses, but in the humility to accept our place in the flow of time. We pack away the tools of our own making and turn toward the horizon. The path ahead is not paved with gold or guarded by iron, but it is steady beneath our feet. We walk forward, leaving the ghosts of pride behind, carrying only the conviction that what we build today must be rooted in something deeper than ourselves. The fire is long cold, the empire is dust, and the future is ours to shape with open hands. We are the architects of our own integrity, and in this quiet moment, the work begins. The wind shifts, carrying nothing but fine, dry grit across the plains. Where the great gates once stood, the ground is level and unremarkable. There is no trace of the king, no remnant of the throne, and no echo of the commands that once moved armies. The desert has reclaimed its own. We turn our backs to the site of the collapse. The weight of the story remains, not as a burden, but as a map. We have seen the end of the pride that built these walls. Now, we look at our own hands. We choose the stones for our own foundations today. We do not use the mortar of arrogance or the bricks of conquest. We use the weight of truth. Every step we take away from these ruins is a deliberate movement toward a different kind of strength. We do not need the protection of massive ramparts when our lives are anchored in reality. The sun is gone, but the stars provide enough light to see the ground beneath our boots. We keep walking. We leave the memory of the fire behind us. We carry the lesson forward, into the quiet, into the work of building something that does not require a crown to be significant. The path is open. The silence is not an end, but a beginning. The horizon is clear, stripped of the jagged silhouettes that once defined the skyline. Nothing remains of the towers or the fortifications that claimed to defy the seasons. The ground is flat, reclaimed by the slow, relentless movement of the earth. We stand where the center of the world once claimed to be, and we feel only the cool air of the evening. The transition is complete. The era of the empire has dissolved into the geology of the plains. We do not look back to measure what was lost, but look down to see where we stand. We test the soil beneath our feet, finding it firm, unburdened by the weight of stone monuments. Our purpose is no longer defined by the reach of an empire, but by the integrity of our own actions. We carry the memory of the fire as a warning, not a blueprint. We choose to build with materials that do not require the oppression of others to hold their shape. The silence of the desert is a teacher, stripping away the illusions of grandeur until only the truth of our own humanity remains. We take a final breath, turn away from the empty space, and walk into the coming night, grounded in the quiet realization that we are not the masters of our own destiny, but the stewards of our own character. The dust settles, leaving the air clear and still. We have walked the perimeter of the ruins and found nothing but the quiet pulse of the earth. The empire that once commanded the world has been reduced to the texture of the sand under our boots. We do not linger. The lesson is etched into the landscape itself, a physical testament to the limits of human reach. We adjust our pace, moving away from the sight. Every step is a rejection of the old ways, a deliberate movement toward a life built on the bedrock of humility. We do not need walls to define our worth. We do not need the labor of others to secure our future. We carry the weight of this history, not as a burden, but as a compass. The night air cools the skin, and the path ahead is visible in the starlight. We continue forward, leaving the memory of the fire to the wind. We are looking at the ground, at the work in front of us, and at the simple, enduring truth that we are stewards of our own character. The story of the city ends here, but the work of building a life on truth begins with the next step. We walk on, anchored, aware, and finally, free. The path stretches ahead, unburdened by the shadows of the past. We have left the site of the collapse, and the silence behind us is no longer a void, but a space for clarity. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of dry earth and cooling stone, erasing the last traces of the fire. We do not look back. The ruins have served their purpose, acting as a final witness to the fragility of pride. We focus on the terrain under our feet, feeling the resistance of the soil, the steady rhythm of our own movement. Every stride is a choice to exist without the need for dominion. We carry no relics, no blueprints, and no desire to reclaim what has been lost to time. The horizon is wide, open, and entirely indifferent to the ambitions that once defined the empire. We are left with the simple, raw reality of our own existence. The story of the city concludes with the wind, and our own story continues with the next step. We walk forward, anchored in the truth. The horizon holds no ghosts. We have moved beyond the reach of the fallen walls, and the ground beneath us is firm. The air is thin and sharp, cooling the lungs with every breath. We track the movement of the sun across the sky, watching the shadows lengthen and dissolve into the earth. There is no monument left to claim, no title to defend, and no empire to sustain. We are left with the weight of our own hands and the clarity of the open road. Every step forward is a deliberate act of choosing the present. Over the echoes of what once was, we feel the grit of the path against our souls, the steady rhythm of our own heartbeats, and the absence of any external command. We are not building toward a future that demands the labor of others. We are building a life that requires only the integrity of our own choices. The story of the city is now just a layer of sediment under the grass. We walk away from the site of the collapse, leaving the memory of the fire to the cooling wind. We are anchored in the simple, enduring reality of the now. The path is clear, the journey is quiet, and we are finally at rest within the truth of our own existence. The final ridge lies ahead. We crest it, and the valley of the fallen city disappears from view. The landscape here is unscarred, defined only by the slow growth of wild grass and the movement of light across the hills. We stop, press our palms against the cool surface of a weathered rock, and feel the stillness of the earth. The silence is not an end, but a baseline. We have seen the cost of building on sand and the inevitable reach of justice. Now, we turn our gaze toward the path that remains. Our feet find purchase on the solid ground. We carry the lesson of the ruins in the rhythm of our own stride. We are not masters of the world, nor are we the architects of its final judgment. The horizon is clear. We take one final breath, steady our resolve, and continue the journey, anchored in the quiet, enduring reality of the present moment.